The Association of the United States Army is pleased to welcome you to AUSA's Thought Leaders Webinar Series, a webinar series featuring military leaders and contemporary military authors. Kicking off today's webinar is AUSA's Vice President of Education, Lieutenant General Guy Swan.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Association of the United States Army's Thought Leaders Webinar Series. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, and while we wish we could be together here at AUSA, that is obviously not possible under current conditions. So what we've done is crafted a series of events to bring you senior Army leaders, authors, and others speaking on topics of great interest to America's Army, all in a live and interactive forum. We're very glad you've joined us today, and we appreciate your support as partners in the defense of our great nation. Today, joining us to discuss his new book is James Carl Nelson, author of The York Patrol, the real story of Alvin York and the unsung heroes who made him World War I's most famous soldier. We all think we know the story of Alvin York, but as you'll find in this discussion today, there's a lot more to the story of Alvin York. We're also joined today by Lieutenant General Ted Stroop, U.S. Army retired, senior fellow here at AUSA, who will moderate this fascinating discussion. For those of us joining online today, please take advantage of having Mr. Nelson here to ask questions. You can use the Q&A tab on the right side of your screen to submit a question. After Mr. Nelson talks to us about his book, we'll take as many of your questions as possible. Also, if you look on the right-hand side of your screen, you will see a Handouts tab. You can click on the Handouts tab and click for offers to purchase Mr. Nelson's book. General Stroop, Ted, thank you very much for agreeing to moderate this for us, and I'll turn the floor over to you to tell us a bit more about our guest today. Over to you, sir.
Well, thank you very much. I enjoy these either as a participant, as you have me doing now, or as somebody on the other side of the screen just watching and listening in. We're really privileged today to have James Carl Nelson, Jim Nelson, to talk about one of his books of the four that he has crafted on World War I. He features Company D in one of his stories. He features 5 lieutenants, which I'll mention in a minute, about 5 Harvard men who joined as a group in World War I. And then he has a story about a Marine, Clifton Cates, whom he follows from Bellawood to the victory in the Great War, and then tops it off with the Polar Bear expedition, which not many Americans are familiar with, about Americans' forgotten invasion of Russia in 1918 and 1919 as part of that war. Jim Nelson is a graduate of the University of Minnesota in 1983 with a degree in journalism. He has spent 35 years as a writer and as a reporter for various publications, to include the Miami Herald. So one of my questions will be, why are you back in Minnesota when you got the weather down in Miami? He's a full-time author. He lives in Minneapolis with his wife, Janet Goodridge, and their 2 sons, Ethan and Nathaniel. And Jim, I'll turn the floor over to you for a very interesting discussion and presentation.
All right, thanks very much. I appreciate it. Thanks for having me here to discuss my latest book. It's actually my 5th book. If anybody's keeping score at home. I'll just start. Anyone of a certain age, no doubt familiar with the movie Sergeant York, which starred Gary Cooper as Alvin York, the most famous doughboy to come out of World War I. The film earned Cooper an Academy Award, but did disservice to 16 men who were with York when he performed the deed that earned him a Medal of Honor. Those men, all part of Company G, 82nd U.S. Division, were instrumental in what occurred on October 8th, 1918 in the Argonne Forest. But what's very rarely talked about is how they and York were actually instrumental in hastening the end of the war by threatening and clearing a portion of the German defenses that caused that caused the Germans to retreat from the Argonne. To set the scene, the American First Army, 9 divisions strong, jumped off into the region of the Meuse River and Argonne Forest on September 26, 1918. The attack went well for 3 to 4 days when stiffening German resistance was encountered. On September 30th, 1918, the American command ordered a pause to reorganize and in some cases swap out fighting divisions for new ones. On the east of the Aire River, the 35th Division had made good progress initially, but ran out of steam just south of the village of Exermont at the base of the Romaine Hills. A veteran division, the 1st, was ordered to relieve the 35th, and on October 4th, it jumped off and headed for the village of Flayville on the left in the imposing hills 240, 272, 263, and 269 above Exermont. Progress was once more made until heavy shelling by German batteries on the heights above the Aire caused the advance to stall. At the same time, a force of mixed battalions of the 77th Division, trying to push west on the west flank of the Aire, became detached from the main body of 77th Division troops, and its men soon found themselves surrounded. The American Brain Trust now faced 2 objectives: rescuing the famous Lost Battalion and reducing the German artillery that stymied the 1st Division's advance. The American commanders hit upon a risky and daring solution. Fresh troops of the 82nd Division, the 163rd and 164th Brigades, will be hurled west across the Aire just below the 1st Division and just north of where the 28th Division was inching north. On October 7th, 1918, battalions of the 327th and 328th Infantry attacked the heights surrounding the village of Châtel-Chehery, and by nightfall, the 1st Battalion, 328th Infantry, had a foothold on the crest of Hill 223. And that is when the York Patrol went into action. The 17-man patrol actually was under the leadership of Acting Sergeant Bernard Early, a pugnacious Irishman and former bartender from New Haven, Connecticut. Among his charges were York, who was then an acting corporal and not a sergeant, Percy Beardsley, a patrician New England farmer, and a corporal from Massachusetts who called himself William Cutting, was in fact named Otis Merrithew. Including Early, 7 of the men were European immigrants. Most of them had trained at Camp Gordon in Georgia, where York, a Christian fundamentalist, had endured a crisis of faith and questioned whether he could or should kill another human being. After some soul searching and convincing by his superiors, he came around, and that backstory would one day become a huge element in his becoming the world's biggest hero of World War I. The training those men received was indeed basic, and the early draftees paraded with sticks rather than rifles, which, with the U.S. trying to build a million-man army almost from scratch, took some time to show up. After leaving the States in 1918, the men trained in England and then were slowly introduced to life in the trenches of France, where they learned mainly to stay below the parapets lest German snipers kill them. For the men of the 328th 2nd Battalion, their only action prior to October of 1918 was to partaking in the Saint-Mihiel offensive, in which they took the village of Norre, which was deserted pretty much by the time they arrived. Forward to the Argonne. On the morning of October 8, 1918, companies G and E of the 328th Infantry picked up the regiment's advance and attacked to the west, but before long found themselves being murdered by German fire to the front and left. After platoon commander Kirby Stewart was killed, Sergeant Harry Parsons sought out Acting Sergeant Bernard Early and ordered him and his squad to infiltrate the woods on Hill 244 to the immediate south and try to reduce the machine guns causing so much damage. The patrol ascended and then descended the hill to a valley marked by a sluggish stream, worked its way to the southwest, and before long found itself behind the German line. A couple of German medics were soon encountered, and when they ran, the men followed, and surprised a large group of German soldiers who were lounging about in a ravine in preparation for heading into battle. The Germans, unaware of the size of the enemy force, surrendered, and the men of the York Patrol, with Bernard Early in command, quickly began disarming the prisoners and preparing them to march them back to the American lines. Unfortunately, the men's training had not extended to such details as establishing a perimeter or checking their flanks, or even, for that matter, taking prisoner a large body of the enemy. And so as they were doing this, lining the Germans up, bursts of machine gun fire rained down from the top of the ravine slope, and the naive and poorly trained hunters that actually entered a trap and would pay for their carelessness. 6 members of the patrol were instantly killed: Corporal Murray Savage and Privates Marion Demowski, Ralph Weiler, Fred Waring, Carl Swanson, and Ralph Waring. And 3, including Early and Merrithew, were wounded. The rest took what cover they could among the trees and behind the prisoners. This is when the legend of Sergeant York began. While fire pinned down the survivors and even hit some of the Germans, killing them, York hunted just behind a gaggle of Germans and, using his rifle and then his pistol, began firing at anything that moved. Several others with the patrol, among them Private Percy Beardsley and Corporal Otis Merrithew, also fired back at the Germans above them. Meanwhile, the German commander, Lieutenant Paul Vollmer, vainly emptied his pistol at York's back, missing each shot. The firefight, which took all of 10 to 15 minutes, ended when a German officer, Lieutenant Fritz Endres, led 5 men in a bayonet charge down the slope, right for York. York shot the trailing Germans methodically, and then shot Endres in the stomach, mortally wounding them. And this was what shook up Lieutenant Paul Vollmer. He had lived in the U.S. for a time, and so he went up to York, and he said, if you stop shooting, I'll order everybody to surrender. York took Vollmer's empty pistol, and once more the men lined up their prisoners, and they were herded back to the American lines, picking up more prisoners on the orders of Vollmer, who had York's service revolver pressed to his back. After herding the prisoners first to Château-Chéry and then to brigade headquarters at Varennes, York encountered Brigade Commander Julian Lindsay. York, Lindsay said, "I heard you have captured the whole German army." "No," York told him, "I only have 132. Word of the fight and the large cache of prisoners got around, even as the patrol's men endured more fighting through the month. Eventually, York was credited with the lion's share of the haul and was awarded its Distinguished Service Cross, and following the Medal of Honor. The legend of York being a one-man army took root, a legend burnished by writer George Patullo, who interviewed York and half a dozen of the men with him, and whose story, The Second Elder Gives Battle, ran in the April 26, 1919 issue of the Saturday Evening Post, which had a circulation of 2 million. But this is the story of a patrol, men acting together for the common good in the face of horrible odds. It's the story of a triumph followed by tragedy, followed once more by triumph, not individual but collective. My book, The York Patrol, attempts to spread the credit around to these other men, those who survived and those who sadly died that day. Some of them, Beardsley and Merrithew for sure, fired back and took credit for dropping some of the German foes. Others had the backs of York and those joining in the firefight, guarding the prisoners and preventing what could have otherwise been a massacre had the Germans known how skimpy the force of American doughboys was. The patrol members also deserve credit for something larger. The patrol's actions led the German battalion on the farthest right of the line to retreat west, allowed the Americans who were attacking companies E and G to once more pick up the advance and cut the DeCauville railway line just to the west that supplied the Germans in the Argonne. This led the German command to order a gradual retreat from the Argonne beginning the next day. The advance of the 327th and 328th regiments on October 7th also caused the Germans to pull back from their encirclement of the lost battalion. As a bonus, another objective was met. The attack resulted in the retreat of heavy German artillery that had pinned down the 1st Division. On October 9th, that advance northwest into the Rhine Hills was resumed, and by October 10th, the 1st Division was atop the range and looking down on the main German defense line at the Côte de Châtillon, which would be taken within the week by the 42nd Division. So much of the overall success was the work of the 17 men of the York Patrol, which almost accidentally, and while fighting really for a little more than their self-survival, crumbled a key portion of the German defenses on the morning of October 8th, 1918. Alvin York, who for religious reasons had initially balked at the idea of killing a fellow human being, came out of this a hero. Eventually, his unit and the rest of the 82nd Division continued fighting through October and lapped up, exhausted and depleted, at the gates of the village of Samarans on October 31st. The war ended here, and the patrol survivors, like most returning doughboys, picked up their former lives and lived the lives of ordinary citizens, all except for York, of course, who returned to the U.S. in May 1919 to find himself a hero. And it would be nice to report that the patrol held annual reunions where they reminisced about their great adventure. But York's celebrity, he was certainly one of the most famous people of the first half of the 20th century, eclipsed the roles of the others who were in that ravine that morning and led to recriminations and enmity among some of them. Before the men received citations for their work, and 11 years after the fact, Bernard Early received his own Distinguished Service Cross. Otis Merrithew, the most vocal of York's deniers, received a Silver Star 47 years after the fact and 1 year after York's own death. York, he finally allowed, fought like a tiger and almost captured the whole damn German army single-handedly, he said at his ceremony. He was a hero. So were they all.
What brought you to write about these other soldiers that were around York? Most of us know the story of York, but not the other players. What was the genesis of this research?
The genesis really was, I begin the book by just talking about there were 13 men who performed deeds on October 8, 1918 in the Argonne, and who wound up getting medals of honor. So I was going to concentrate really on just, I was going to call it like the Day of Days or something like that. And but I had a list of next book ideas I presented to my agent, Jim Hornfisher. And he said, why don't you do a Remains of Company D on the York Patrol? My first book was about my grandfather's unit of the 1st Division, Company D of the 20th Infantry. Just sort of take a look at them and try to highlight what they did. And that's really where the book began.
Yeah, it's an interesting story. I noticed up front, you mentioned it, that there, on that day, the 8th of October, there were 13 Medals of Honor awarded that day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, all across from east to west in the Argonne.
Yeah, that's amazing. And of all those heroes, York stood out the most, certainly in history. But fascinating that would occur.
Well, I would say my book is also about the process of how that happened, how he, 13 men, how he became the hero. Because John Pershing actually wanted another person to be known as renowned as, I'm blanking on his name, but yeah. So it's about the process too.
Yeah. I've got a question here from the audience that says, how do you compare your book to the book on York's detailed hour by hour that was published several years afterward? Are you familiar with that one?
Or
other books?
Tom Scahill's book? Yeah,
I think
his own war diary. How do I compare my book? Well, I think I give the whole gestalt of what was really going on. I mean, his book, the book I used, Tom Scahill's book, it's number one, it's very annoyingly written in a real Tennessee backwoods patois. And, my book gives an overall view of what was going on, overall view of what other regiments were doing and who these men with York were, which York touches on a little bit, not very much.
Right. Well, Ted, we got you back on. You have a couple of questions. Go ahead.
As I had mentioned earlier, I've read the book, and as Jim and I were discussing ahead of time, I've walked the ground several times, not knowing that your book was coming out a number of years later. So it's really fascinating. What is another portion of the book that I really like are the history pictures you put in there, because if one cannot walk the ground, you can get a feel for the black and white photos from 1919 and 1918. And then the photos that you have put in there of the participants. I think as General Swan said, this may be entitled about York, but you've done an excellent job of weaving in the lives of those 17 men, 11 of them who survived.
Thank you.
Can you discuss what you talked about in terms of what York's life was like in terms of marksmanship with a rifle back in his home before he was drafted into the Army?
Well, yeah, I'd say of all the guys in that platoon or that patrol, he certainly had the most experience with a rifle. His father was an avid hunter. Growing up in the Tennessee Hills, you had to hunt your own game. And York participated in turkey shoots, as in the movie. they show to a very corny extent. But he became a good shot with a musket, and displayed that during training at Camp Gordon too. I know that's the legend of his shooting, and then during the Fritz Enders's charge, I always wrote about how he shot the last man coming down the hill first, so that no one would see a guy ahead of him falling. So he went boom, 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 left to right, and then shot Endress. So I mean, that's something that he claimed that he learned while hunting turkeys. So yeah.
The division came from all over the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And
it's called the All-American.
Right. And it was then the 82nd. And now we have on our active rolls the 82nd Airborne.
Mm-hmm.
When do you know when it picked up, the division picked up the All-American nickname?
I don't know. It's like everybody calls the first division the Big Red One, but that came about in World War II.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't call themselves that in World War One. I don't know. Was it in hindsight? I don't know.
What I know, never having served in the 82nd, was that its name really goes back to World War One.
Okay.
Because it was a conglomerate of men from all over the states, as you point out on those initial 17 men in the York Patrol. So it's somewhere along it just picked up the AA and the All-American Division. They came from all over. In the patrol itself, after the war was over, who were the strongest advocates of York's feats initially after the war?
Well, I know that his former battalion commander, Buxton, was they did an investigation. They took affidavits from about half a dozen of the guys. Unfortunately, Merrithew and Bernard Early had been wounded, and so I don't know what they would have said in their affidavits. But the strongest advocates after the war was York, for sure. Harry Parsons, his sergeant, always backed him up whenever any kind of controversy erupted. And a lot of the men just stayed silent. And Percy Beardsley was very circumspect. He said it sort of kind of cryptically at one time in an interview in the 40s or whatever that, he was asked how York did what he did, and he said, well, I guess he just surrounded him. I thought that was kind of snarky, So this who publicly supported him was Parsons, the brass of the Army. Most of those guys stayed silent. A lot of those guys just sort of disappeared into everyday life. You never heard anything from Theodore Soak or Michael Sakina, immigrants. So it's hard to say that there was any one person who was a big supporter of York after this. I think his celebrity was resented. As is one of the tragedies of his life. I don't think he wanted it. He didn't exploit it, at least for 10 years until he let Scale interview him for his book. So it was kind of like one of the life-changing things for that king kind of, in some respects, kind of ruined his life. He never really made a lot of money off of it until the movie came out in 41. And then, he didn't pay his taxes, so he was hounded by the IRS. So I can't see that really you could say that he's benefited out of what happened in the George Patello story and his legend.
Beardsley is one you mentioned, and I think you have a photograph of Beardsley in there, getting his Distinguished Service Cross.
That's early getting his DSC.
Oh, it's early. Okay. The accuracy of the maps that you have in the book, they indicate that they were updated later. Can you give us a little background on that? I'm not challenging your veracity. I'm just saying, being a map man, I just found that interesting in terms of how the maps are described, particularly the ones that were Major Buxton and Captain Danforth upgraded a little bit later by pushing an X on where the action took place.
Well, I think that map is correct. The Buxton map and showing the route to the site and back. I know there's there's controversy about where the actual site was. I was there in 2019, and I, you know, I walked in that ravine. I said, "This has got to be the place." It's on the left of the line, and we all know there's another site that's about, I'd say, half a kilometer north of that purports to be the York site. I went there. It's the one that's marked as the York Trail, and it has a billboard, whatever, with the photos of some of the guys. That seems to be incorrect, because that would have been in the very face of the advance of Company E and G. But York Patrol was sent to the left to try to clear the guns from the left. They were just hammering because the platoon was on the far left of Company G in the advance. So I would say that I think Buxton had it right.
In the actual period of getting ready for the combat that went on with the patrol and that, how did York's patrol communicate with its higher headquarters, say its battalion, the 328th Battalion headquarters?
Well, they didn't communicate while they were in that ravine, and there was no communication. There's no runners sent back and forth or anything like that. I mean, nobody knew where they were. Danforth, the company commander, didn't even know they had gone on this little foray. So until they paraded all these Germans out of the woods, that was the first communication they had. And they were concerned that the Americans were going to fire at them when they saw this large group of Germans coming at them from the west. So I would say there was very little communication.
Okay. The mention of General Pershing and Sam Woodfill and his story.
That's the name I was looking for, was Sam Woodfill. Woodfill, yeah.
What's the background on that?
Well, he may have a point, because what Sam Woodfill did truly was, he acted like a one-man army. He had a series of encounters. I think it was October 14th, 1918. And he raided German machine gun nests, and he killed guys who he encountered on the trail. And he really was pretty much acting alone. I think towards the end of his busy day, he picked up a couple of privates and got some help from them. And I think, that was just something that, for whatever reason, Pershing thought that was maybe he was the one-man army who deserved the recognition. He didn't have George Patello to write about him, though. So, and you know what? One of the big things about York is it's a sexy story, because it's the backstory about how he didn't want to fight. We really questioned whether, they said he was a CO. That came from Rosier Pike, who was his pastor back home in Fentress County, Tennessee. He wrote to Washington, to the Army, whoever, and said, can you declare Alvin York a conscientious objector? We follow the Bible literally. First command is "Thou shalt not kill." But York always said, no, it wasn't that I wanted to be a CO. I just wanted to know what the war was about. What's all this fighting about? In his colloquial way. He was a very backwoods person. He did 2 years of education. He's not used to thinking about bigger issues, which his commanders tried to instruct him on. He just wanted to know what was going on. Well, what the whole point was.
Did the 328th and York in particular, besides being in the Meuse Argonne, did you discover that particular unit with York in it had participated in some of the other campaigns that the division had been in?
Yeah, I write. In fact, I spent some time. They were involved in the Samuel operation further to the east, and they actually were stayed in place on the night of the jump off. It was mid-September 1918, and they went into action the next day, and they were ordered to go to the town of Norroy, and take that. Like I say, it was pretty much devoid of Germans. They took off in the middle of the night when they knew the Americans were coming, and they had left behind like 90 townsmen who they'd captured and held for hostage for a while. So there wasn't really a whole lot of blood spilled initially, especially in the 2nd Battalion of the 328th. There was, I think it was the 1st Battalion, was the 3rd Battalion, maybe. I'd have to go back and look. But they charged a town to the north of there and took severe casualties. They just attacked this town across an open field And that's where the only other Medal of Honor awarded in the 82nd Division was given for a guy there who aided wounded men.
I think your mentioning and your description of his relationship with his girlfriend and then later his wife, Gracie, is another story to be told. Can you elaborate on what you know about that relationship?
Well, York was a lot older than her. He was like, I think she was like 16 or something. He was about 28 when he started trying to woo her. And I think his relationship with her, her family didn't like him at all. They didn't like the real fundamentalist people. It was like there were different faiths in that area. They thought they were kind of crazy people. So York had that against him, and he was a hellraiser when he was in his 20s. He was a big drinker and fighter and gambler and whatever you had. But I think part of one of the reasons he finally came to Jesus under the wing of Rosier Pike was he wanted to become better for Gracie so he could have a chance of wooing her. I did see some letters he wrote to her, and he can write a lot better than you would think. It's just printed out. If you read Tom Scales' book, I tell you what, you think this guy's totally illiterate, but he could write some letters and just sort of saying, hey, I can't wait till he can get back, see you again, and pretty simple stuff. But she waited for him. Yeah.
Well, it's quite a story because if you have to really read the book to see the significance of Gracie had on his life before he went to war and then afterwards. In fact, as my wife grazed through your book, she came across a picture of Gracie and Alvin, and she said, boy, she's very young.
Yeah, like I say, he was, he got back when he was 30, 31, and so she was still like maybe 18 years old. So yeah.
Right. Well, it's a great story to be told. What other activities about York getting back to the States? I found that his trip back on the boat till he got to New York, I don't think he didn't know what was really happening to him, did he? Washington?
Yeah, like I say, he knew he had the Medal of Honor, and there was a ceremony. I think it was in late March or in April in France. I don't think he could have known just what had happened to his story until the boat arrived in New York, because Patullo's story in the Saturday Evening Post was published on April 26, 1919. It was picked up by newspapers all across, probably I would almost say the world. He was presented as, all the headlines are like, one-man army subdues entire German battalion. It was totally overblown. But he got found, he was welcomed. I mean, they had people, Tennessee dignitaries, officials waiting at the dock when he arrived. And I don't know if until he entered New York Harbor that he could have known that that kind of welcome was waiting for him. And then, and it wasn't something he was comfortable with. He was shown around town for like 3 or 4 days. Then he was trained down to Washington, D.C., and he went to Congress. And, I don't think it made him real comfortable, I'll be honest.
We may have talked about this earlier the last time we had our session. One of the things I found very interesting in your book that impacted on our family was my wife's great uncle was the senator that greeted him in the Capitol, and you mentioned the name. So
interesting.
And that had quite a connection there, and then it leaped right out of the page as far as our family goes. And I called her and I said, "Hey, look at here. That family is from Georgia,
okay.
and had stayed there for a while." As I told you earlier, one of the reasons that we were going around France and outside of my previous work with AUSA was to go over the terrain where her cousin fought, who was killed, 10 days after the York event. But that's another story.
Oh, wow.
Have you been able to follow, or did you find a need to follow on the modern day current relatives of members of the York Patrol?
I was in touch with some of them, yeah.
And what's their feeling about this? Oh, it's interesting, or we're happy it happened, or?
I don't think they're necessarily going to be real happy with my book. No, I mean, I don't know. Not some of them. I sent the book just last week to Carol Schultes, who is like a grandniece of Domowski, Miriam Domowski, and I haven't heard back what she thinks of it. I sent a copy to Deborah York, who is York's great granddaughter, who's not one of the family members, obviously. I know it's a very touchy thing. They have many of them have a point of view that started in 1918 and 19. That why didn't their ancestors get more credit for what went down, which I'm trying to do in the book. So I have not heard from them yet. I probably will. I didn't want in any way to have them feel like I was using them.
Mm-hmm.
That if I didn't publish what their version of events, I didn't want them to think that I was using them. So, well, it'd be interesting to see.
One of the things that some people may not have grasped is that some of the awards came in later. I think you have an Otis Merrithu, or he got a Silver Star later on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in 1965. He tried through the years. When the movie opened, Otis went down to the theaters and went in the theater and gave his talk about his version of what really happened that day, and he petitioned for credit. And finally, during the Johnson administration, he finally, received his Silver Star, which he should have in the beginning. I think, like I say, I think it would be interesting to know what he would have said if he had been given an affidavit in the month or two or three after the action went down. Most of the guys were interviewed like in February of 1919, preparatory to York's the investigation, and did York deserve a medal? So I don't know why it took Otis so long. I think, like I say, York overshadowed everybody. And I think a lot of people were like, no, we like the one-man army story better,
Well, I think I might have said this already before I got cut off as we started. The thing that was fascinating for me was the way you detailed all 17 men, 11 who survived out of that patrol. Clearly, it gives the impression that there's more to the story than just Sergeant York and Gary Cooper on the black and white screen.
Yeah, right. And and that's, I don't even know if today young people would even really know about that movie very much. I mean, I used to see it twice a year when I was a kid. It was on Family Classics with Fraser Thomas on WGN in Chicago. So I knew that story forever growing up, but I don't know if people really are aware of it now.
Did York's involvement in making the movie, what can you tell us about that?
Well, he was reluctant to be involved in the making of the movie originally, and he had to be talked into it. And then he struck kind of a hard bargain. He got like $50,000 up front, and he took 2% of the gross. He was savvy enough to do that. He did have an attorney. I don't think he had really, it's interesting. I tell the story too. The producers of the movie sent these people into Fentress County so they could get a feel for how people talked, how people dressed, things like that. But York himself was not really, I don't think, that involved in the creative process, although it was based on the book Scale did, another book that Samuel Cowan did. But I don't think he went to Hollywood and met with Cary Cooper. I want to call him Cary Grant, and they got along famously. They were both, Cooper was from Montana and he was a rural boy too, and they were able to talk guns and hunting and things like that. But I don't think York had much input in the actual product.
The last time I think you were in France, you said it was 2019.
Mm-hmm.
We were there earlier, walking the ground and that, and now you've caused me to think: did we walk the right place? We did do the York Trail, but mm-hmm. one of the military historians that was with us that is still with AUSA, he took us over closer, I say, to Hill 244. Is that controversy still going on or not?
like I say, when I went with Frederick Castier, who my guide, who had been with Tom Nolan's team when he was doing an archaeological study of this ravine, and found tons of material, American and German. And so Frederick, brought me to Chateau Chéry. We walked west down a dirt road, and as soon as I got it, right there on the left, that looked like the place to me. And later in the day, we did the circumnavigation of the York Trail. And my impression was that, number one, that area, it just plunges so steeply to the forest floor. It just didn't seem like it could be the place at all. I mean, it's just way too steep. And like I say, it would have been in the main advance of companies E and G. And so it doesn't really make sense that if they were sent off to the left, they would have circled back all the way to be in the face of the advance. It was to the left. So I think maybe that's my opinion. So I don't know if it's still a raging controversy. Does anybody really care?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Well, I certainly have immensely enjoyed the book, and I've read some earlier books on York. I'm not sure General Swan would want me to do this, but I just finished reading this book.
Yay for you!
And it's how about telling us before we close out your book on 5 lieutenants, which features 5 Harvard graduates.
Mm-hmm.
So what's the thrust of that book before we close out here?
Well, what was nice about that book is the center of the book is the relationship between George Haydock and Richard Newhall. They became inseparable during the spring months of 1918 in Company L of 28th Infantry. That's what attracted me to it. And then you can't just do a book about 2 guys. And then they knew these other guys, smart guys. They know them in college. So I just thought 5, and there was George Redwood, who was actually a very heroic figure too. 5 guys. And it's funny, what I learned doing that book is interesting is there was a rush among Harvard men, and more Harvard men than any other college served in World War I. I think it was sort of a legacy of service in the families where those men came from. But really, yeah, the main thing, the thing that attracted me to that story was Richard and George. And I'm not going to spoil the ending for you. I don't know how far you are. But Newhall wound up writing about their relationship for the rest of his life. So
well, it is. I have enjoyed it as much as I had your other book, and I'm going to go look for some other ones. So I'd recommend that people pay attention to what James Carl Nelson or Jim Nelson puts out. It's quality writing. I know AUSA is happy and proud that you've been able to participate with us. And if General Swan is on the line, I will pass the baton back to you. And Jim, thanks again.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, Jim, thank you very much for not only for today's discussion, but for this important book. I would point out to the audience that the book was just published this week. So be one of the first in your neighborhood to purchase one of the books by going to the handouts tab on the right-hand side of your screen. Jim, the book is not only a fascinating story of one man's journey in World War I, but the York story is an American story. It's part of American history, Army history, and thank you for bringing that to us.
Thank you.
Ted, General Stroop, thank you for participating. It's always great to have you ask insightful questions of our guests. So thank you very much for your participation today and every day. Thank you. Before we part this afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, I want to bring you up to speed on some upcoming events here at AUSA. Our next AUSA Noon Report will be on the 10th of March and will feature Lieutenant General Laura Potter, the Deputy Chief of Staff, G2, the Army's senior intelligence officer, who will be talking about the vision for Army intelligence. We appreciate the sponsorship of that event by our national partner, Leidos. And then 16 to 18 March, we will be featuring a virtual version of the AUSA Global Force Next Symposium. 3 days of discussion about Army modernization and many of the major initiatives going on inside the United States Army. AUSA Global Force Next, 16 to 18 March. And then our next AUSA Thought Leaders webinar will be on the 24th of March, and that will be entitled Her Story. It'll be a panel discussion of 4 authors, soldiers, female soldiers, former soldiers, discussing their experiences in the United States Army. And that'll be fascinating given that March is Women's History Month. And then lastly, don't forget AUSA's annual meeting, always a major event in October here in Washington, D.C., 11 to 13 October. We're hoping we can get back to the convention center downtown and see all of you in person. So the AUSA annual meeting and exposition will be 11 to 13 October. These are just some of the great events and speakers that we have coming up for you this summer and into the fall. For more information on these events or any other events here at AUSA, visit the website at ausa.org. And finally, we want to thank you for your membership in AUSA. Your membership really does matter. It helps all of us support the soldiers, families, veterans, retirees that make up America's Army. So thank you for your membership. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for a great afternoon and have a great Army Day.